So within 3 days there was the makings of a nice pitched battle outside the embassy. Moriarty and I took the trouble to stroll by every now and then, to see how the pot was boiling. Hawk-eyed the professor spotted a face peering from a downstairs window. "That's sucked," he said. "I could pot him from here," I volunteered. "I've a revolver in my pocket. It'd be a dicey shot, but I could make it." Moriarty's head wavered. He was calculating odds. He would only be replaced. We know who Supt is. Another secret police chief might not be such a public figure. My right hand was itching and I had a thrill in my water. I had a notion to haul out and blast away, just for sport and hang the scheme. There were enough bearded anarchists about to take the blame. Sometimes an idea takes your fancy, and there's nothing to do but give in. Moriarty's bony hand was on my wrist, squeezing hard. His eyes shone. Cobra eyes. That would be a mistake, Moran. My wrist hurt. A lot. The professor knew where to squeeze. He could snap bones with what seemed like a pinch. He let me have my hand back. Moriarty rarely smiled, and then usually to terrify some poor victim. The first time I heard him laugh, I thought he had been struck by deadly poison, and the stutter escaping through his locked jaws was a death rattle. That day's Times report from Ruritania solicited from him an unprecedented fit of shoulder. Shaking giggles. He wound his fingers together like the claws of a praying mantis. The prompt for this hilarity was Black Michael's vow to free the Zenda Cannon girls. "Let us wish him luck in finding them," the professor said. "How delicious that the Duke should be our staunch ally in this enterprise. Then again, Queen Victoria has also expressed sympathy for our imaginary orphans." Flashes came from the embassy. My hand was on my revolver. "More photographs," the professor said. Colonel Supt's hobby. Supt's face was gone, but the box and lens affair was pressed against the window. Moriarty and I had coats casually pulled up over our faces, against the wind. The secret police chief likes to know his enemies, Moran. A man in his position collects them. Why's Supt in London anyway? Shouldn't he be cracking down on bomb throwers on his home turf? Moriarty pondered the question. If we are to believe Miss Adler, Supt can best serve his cause here. His cause. Up the red, down the black. But the Hilperberg brothers are halfway across Europe. So Supt's attention is directed here on subtler business. The woman. Moriarty's shoulders lifted and dropped. The old goat probably hopes she'll give him a tumble to get her snaps back, I suggested. I'll wager he pulls the pics out of the safe every night and gives them a proper looking over. If that were the case, she wouldn't even engage us. Miss Adler does not strike me as a lady who likes to share. Yet she has willed over half the earnings of a profitable enterprise to us. No choice, Moriarty. Who else could get her what she wants? The professor tapped his teeth. No one but us, Moran. Evidently. Moriarty's fingers went to his watch pocket. In my years of association with the professor, I never saw him pull out the timepiece I presume anchored the chain across his flat middle. Once an associate understood the import of timekeeping, everything went to schedule. Otherwise there might have been consequences. He had barely stroked his chain when filthy Fanny dashed from the crowd and began kicking the police guard. Fanny had been successfully presenting herself as a 10-year-old waif for a full 2 decades without anyone being the wiser. It was down to the proper application of dirt, which she arranged on her face with a skill other tarts devote to the use of paints and powder. Now filth wore the sooty skirts of a Zenda Cannon girl. And heavy shin. Kicking clogs. She harangued in back slang the Iscalop. That sounded mighty like Ruritanian, or whatever heathen tongue they use. After some painful toe to shin business, the plot got his truncheon out. With a command of a dramatic that would put the Drury Lane tragedy into shame, Phil tumbled down the embassy steps, squirting tomato juice from a sponge clapped over her eye. Moriarty handed me a cobblestone and pointed. Then the mob rose and rushed the embassy. Moriarty hooked me with an umbrella handle and we milled in with the crowd. The front doors caved and the first rush of intruders slid about on the polished marble foyer floor like drunken skaters. 3 guards tried to unscabbard sabers, but the Comanche set about stripping them and the environs of anything redeemable. Sepp poked his head out of his door. Moriarty signaled. A couple of bruisers laid hands on the secret police chief. The professor sidled next to the anarchist with the biggest beard and suggested he draw up a list of demands, phrasing it so the fellow would think the whole thing was his idea. Sepp looked about furiously, moustache twitching. Dirty hands held him fast. A bunch of keys rattled on Sepp's belt. Moriarty pointed them out and an urchin brushed past, deftly relieving Sepp of the keys. "Give him a taste of what the cannon girls get," I shouted. We left the mob happily shoving the police chief feet. First up the nearest chimney. The anarchist had posted lookouts at the doors, and was waving an ancient revolver at the still surprised constables. "You can't rush us," Comrade Beard said. "This Ruritanian territory is claimed by the Free Citizens Committee of Strelsa-Ulstead. Any action against us will be interpreted as a British invasion." Except, it appeared, had got stuck. With all this going on, it was a simple matter to slip into Sepp's private office, take down the portrait and open the safe. It contained a thick sealed packet, and, disappointingly, no cash box or surplus crown jewels. Moriarty handed me the goods, and looked about, browsing it in mild puzzlement. "What? Too easy. No Moran. It's just as I foresaw." He locked the safe again. There was a clatter of carriages and boots outside. Boscobel Place was full of eager fellows in uniform. "They've called out the troops." "Time to leave," the professor said. Back in the foyer, Moriarty gave a nod. Our Comanche confederates left off bothering, and detached themselves from those still intent on making the political point. Sepp had fallen headfirst out of the chimney, sooty as a sweep. The professor arranged the surreptitious return of his keys. We left the building as we came, through the front door. The Comanche melted into another crowd. As often, Moriarty had contrived not to be noticed. Like those lizards who can blend into greenery, he had the knack of seeming like a forgettable old stick, someone who has got off the omnibus to stop surly, and wandered into a bloodbath which was none of his doing. We strolled away from the battle. Shouts, shots, thumps, crashes and bells sounded. Nothing to do with us. A cab waited on the corner. Moriarty was in a black thinking mood. He chewed little violet pastils of his own concoction, a substitute for the cigarettes, which had yellowed his fingers and teeth but were now abandoned because he'd taken it into his head to deem tobacco a threat to human health and paced his room, hands knotted in the small of his back, brow set in a crinkled frown. I was still full of the thrill of jihackery, and minded to pop downstairs to call on Flossie or Pussy, or whatever the tiny blonde with the lazy eye said she was called. After the hunting grounds, the boudoir. I'd learned that in India, along with how to keep an eye on your wallet in the back of your trousers, while they redraped over a chair. Fifi. Her name was Fifi. She really was French. And she had a friend, Veronier. But the professor was preoccupied. The evening papers were in along with Tia. Sheets of fuller reports that would be in tomorrow's editions. Sepp was claiming that dangerous Ruritanian revolutionary movements needed to be exterminated. He called upon Great Britain, Ruritania's ancient ally, to join the crusade against insurrection, alleging that the assault upon the embassy, and his person, had been equally an insult to Victoria and Rudolph. Typical foreign sod wanting us to fight his battles for him. Back in Stresley there had been street skirmishes between Michaels and Rudolphits. Many arrests had been made and Sepp was expected to return to his country with information, which would lead to a complete sweep of the organized troublemakers. The packet of photographs lay on our bureau. It seemed that reclaiming this property of Lady had interesting side effects. Moriarty's imaginary revolution had genuinely to be put down. I hope the blasted country don't go up in flames before Irene can cash these chips, Moriarty. She'll get no blackmail boodle out of them if they re-hanging from lampposts in the public gardens. Moriarty growled. He left the room and closeted himself in the dark, buzzing space where he raised his wasps and plotted the courses of heavenly bodies. Speaking of heavenly bodies, my eyes went to the packet. I remembered the line of Irene Adler's throat, the trim of her calves under silk, the swell of. I listened out. Moriarty was whistling to his wasps, likely to be absorbed for hours. There was no tread on the stair and Mrs. Halifax was ordered to keep all callers away. So, no chance of interruption. I sat at the bureau, and turned up the gas lamp to illuminate the blotter. With a deft bit of knifery, I lifted the seal intact so it could be reattached with no one the wiser. With a warm pulse in my vitals, I slid the contents out of the packet. It was like iced water tipped into my lap. There were photographs. Views of Zenda Castle, with figures on the battlements. One wore a gauzy hat with a dead bird stuck to it, the other a comic opera uniform. Even at distance I recognized the lovebirds. Irene Adler and Colonel Sept. Disgusting, I blurted. A sheet of paper was slipped into a sheaf of photographs.
My dear Moran, I knew you'd not be able to resist a peek at these artistic studies. Sorry for the disappointment. L proves unprofitable. I suggest you license them to a manufacturer of postcards. My very best to the professor. I knew I could rely on him to toss a pebble in the pond, sending out ripples enough to make a maelstrom. An ordinary workman would just have secured the package and been done with it. Only a genius on the level of a Bonaparte could turn a simple task into the prompt for turmoil raised across a whole continent. Please convey the thanks of another colonel. Being chief of secret police in one of the most peaceable, least insurrection blighted spots on the map was not a career with a future. Valpurbergs were intent on retiring him, but now I fancy he'll be kept on with an increase in salary. I expect you to retain the last figure for sentimental reasons, and I remain, dear Colonel Moran, very truly yours, Irene Adler. I flipped through several more entirely innocent tourist photographs of picturesque Jordania, until at the bottom of the stack I beheld the full face of the American Nightingale. In this final, studio posed photograph she wore the low cut bodice she defected on her visit to Condit Street, somewhat loosened and lowered, though dash it. Artistic fogging around the edges of the portrait prevented complete immodesty. Behind me a door opened. I swiveled in the chair. Moriarty looked at me, eyes shining. He had thought it through and was unhappy. When the professor was unhappy, other creatures, animals, children, even fool grown men tended to learn of it in extreme and uncomfortable manners. Moriarty, I began, I am afraid we've been stung. I held up Irene's photograph. He spat out a word. And that was how great shambles broke out in Belgravia, shaking the fire of Kingdom of Jordania, and how the worst plans of Professor Moriarty were exploited by a woman's treachery. When he speaks of Irene Adler, or when he refers to her photograph, it is always as that bitch.